I made it to Marceline, Missouri, hometown of Walt Disney. All right, so I made it to the Walt Disney Hometown Museum here in Marceline, Missouri on a very hot September day. And I was lucky enough to book an interview with Kaye Malins, the executive director of the museum. So we're going to go inside and talk to Kaye. She has a lot of interesting, unique stories about Walt and Roy and Ruth and the family. She has a personal connection to him, a personal family connection. So let's go talk to Kaye and find out all about Walt Disney. All right, I'm here with Kaye Malins, Executive Director of the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, Missouri, to learn all about her personal connection to Walt and the family and her family's connection, so I'm going to let her take it away.
The first time I met Walt Disney, I was 8 years old, and he was standing in my living room. He'd come back to dedicate the Walt Disney swimming pool and park, and he was staying with my family. And the last 10 years of his life are the years that I actually knew Walt Disney. So it started at that moment, and I'm still doing it because he was such a lovely, engaging man, and my life just kind of intertwined. We made lots of trips to California. My dad and Walt became partners on what he wanted to do here in Marceline with the Marceline project. He looked at my dad on that visit and he goes, "Do you know it's my boyhood home farm?" And my dad said, "Yes, I do." And Walt said, "You can buy it cheaper than I can, go buy it." And from that time on, Walt was a huge part of our life. We never knew when he was going to pop in. He could be taking the train from one coast to another, and he'd say, "Hey, I'm here, pick me up at the train station." And so he'd come and have dinner or spend the night with us in between trains. And it was nothing for me to pick up the phone and it'd be, "Hey, Kay, this is Walt, I need to talk to your dad." So those 10 years were pretty exciting for us, making all the trips back and forth to California to see him.
Talk about your dad and his connection to Walt, how they met, why they met, what the significance of that relationship was.
Well, actually, my family's relationship with Walt started because we had air conditioning. When he came back in 1956, everybody was really excited, but then reality struck in, and it was the Disneys, and we had no place for them to stay. They were coming in July and it was hot and our hotel wasn't air conditioned and it was kind of run down. So my folks had just built this new house with air conditioning. The city council said to my folks, "How about the Disney stay with you?" And that was the beginning. Well, when Walt came back and he and my dad just kind of clicked. On that visit they went to the farm and it was obvious that Walt was falling in love with the farm all over again. And so was Roy. They were like little boys punching each other going, "Look at that, remember this, it's still there." I think one of the selling points was they walked down and Walt's dreaming tree was still there. They said, "Oh, it's still there." So it was that night at our house, in our family room, and Walt looked at my father and said, "Did he know who could buy it?" And Walt said, buy it for me. So he wanted the farm and he wanted options on several hundred acres around it. So they started putting that parcel together. Dad was buying all of it for him. When it all was purchased, we received a check from Ratlaw, and Walt was doing this not through the Disney company, but he was doing it through his own private company because it was a heart connection for him. So he and Roy, this was their dream. When my dad would go out there, he said it was really interesting because either Walt or Roy would walk him back to his car. And if he walked with Walt, Walt would say, "You know, Roy owns the purse strings around here. And so the next time we have a meeting, I'll say this, you say that, I'll say this, we'll shut up and he'll go for it." And then the next time, Roy would walk him to the car and he would say, "You know, Walt doesn't care about money, but, you know, we have a budget on this thing. So next time, I'll say this, you say that, I'll say this, we'll shut up, and he'll go for it." So Dad he said he always wished he had a tape recorder when all this was happening because it was the brothers working each other in their own way. Sometimes I got to go on those visits, I got to go on those trips with my dad, and it was always very exciting when I got to go on those. At the studios, Walt had his table and Roy had his table. Luckily, usually if we were eating there with them, Roy would come over to Walt's table. So my memories of the studio are very vivid to me.
What amazes me most is that, you know, you don't really think about another studio head, another film producer, television producer. You don't think of another person like the same way you think of Walt Disney. You don't really sit there and think about where the head of Sony lived when he was 7, or where the vice chairman of Fox grew up and what they did. But for some reason, there is that deep emotional personal connection to Walt Disney and his hometown and the people he knew, like you. Why are we like that with Walt? What is it about him in your eyes that makes us crave more? We want to know details about this person's or these people's lives that we don't want to know about other people's lives. So what is it about this whole story that makes it like that?
It's because Walt used that part of his life. He used the Marceline part of his life for the rest of his life. He did a whole genre of movies that were based on his time here in Marceline, and he gave us little snippets of that time here. And it was such a warm, glowing time for him in his life that he wanted to share it with the world. I mean, if you think about when you walk into Disneyland, you have to walk down Main Street, USA, before you can get to any other land. Mm-hmm. He wanted to share his time in Marceline. And the few years he was here, he got to be a kid.
Right.
After he left here, he had at least 2 jobs.
Yeah.
The rest of his life. It was hard scrabble. And here he was, king of the countryside. He went fishing at Yellow Creek. He went ice skating. He did all the things little boys dream of doing. So when you come to Marceline, you come to the Walt Disney Hometown Museum, you see the story of Walt and Marceline. And you see the story of the rest of his family. Now, Ruth, Walt's little sister, was a friend of mine most of my adult life. And she wanted their story told here. So Marceline was an important part of her life as well. She had told me one time when I was visiting her, she's, Kay, I want you to have my stuff. And I didn't give it another thought. And Ruth passes away, and her son Ted calls me, and she says, Mom wants you to have her stuff. I had no idea what we were talking about. So I flew out there with an empty suitcase, thinking there'd be enough stuff for an exhibit at City Hall. They started taking things out of the tops of closets, out beneath beds. I go way over my head here. Went back, got some help from Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, flew back out with cameras and scanners, and we documented 3,000 artifacts. They didn't know what they had, and I wasn't about to take anything until the family really knew what was in those sacks and in those boxes. So I felt very strongly to follow the promise I made to Ruth, that we would tell the story of her family here in Marceline, and that's what we're doing. Well, the reason I live on the farm today is because, as we shared earlier, that Walt had my dad buy the property for what he called the Marceline Project. After Walt's untimely death, Retlaw sold all the land back to my dad. When my husband and I decided to settle here in Marceline, we thought it'd just be for a few years. Dad said, well, why don't you live in the house? And we go, well, okay, thinking we'd just be there a little while. Well, that was over 40 years ago. And I know I'm exactly where I need to be.
Because it's open to the public, tell me what people can expect when they go to visit, not the house,
yes,
because the house is private, but tell me about what they can expect when they visit the farm.
When you come to the farm, I just think there needs to be a place that everybody can connect with Walt. And since the farm was so important to him, I thought it needed to be that people could go on the farm for free. When you get there, there's a little parking lot, and there's a little path that takes you by where Walt's Dreaming Tree was. You'll see the son of Dreaming Tree, which his grandson and 3 Walt Disney World ambassadors planted from a seed from the original tree. Mm-hmm. It's about 40 feet tall now. It's doing really well. Then you walk on around the path, and you get to the Disney barn. And I know all of you know the story about Walt's first foray into show business was in the barn in Marceline, and it was so important to him, he recreated it on his estate in California. Well, in 2001, we had an old-fashioned 3-day barn raising with all volunteers. And the Disney family sent us the blueprints for the barn in California. And we barn came home again. They constructed it on the Disney farm. So thousands and thousands and thousands of people have been there. In 2001, the Disney company had a beam at Disneyland for guests to sign. They shipped it back to be installed in our barn. Our guests saw it and they wanted to leave their own name, their own autograph. Now you can hardly find a place to sign your name inside the barn. And it is very dear. It's like Walt's there, because there'll be messages where people are just pouring their heart out. You know, Walt, you have no idea what your show on Sunday night meant to me and to my family. So it's a really special place. Now you'll also see the pond, and Walt told the story on himself. He said, you know, I was quite a hog rider. I used to jump on the back of an old sow and grab her by her ears, and she'd dump me in the pond the same place every time. Well, that pond is still there, so you can see it when you're at the barn.
Excellent. So Kay, tell me something, some sort of story or anecdote that's personal to you, or something you would like the world to know about one of the brothers. It doesn't have to be Walt, it could be Roy. Of course, they're both incredibly significant, equally significant in my own personal opinion. So tell me a story that you know, or something that you want the world to know about one of them.
Well, one of my favorite stories about Roy is when we were visit the studios, Walt would be with us for a while. We'd go on set, but Roy would stay with us the whole time. And I loved horses. I always had horses. And we were at a Western that they were filming. And the horses were really, really big. But I'm over and I have on my little white gloves, my little white dress, and I'm over with one of the horses. And so Roy came over because he was worried about me, because Roy took care of everybody. Roy not only took care of the finances, he took care of people. He took care of the people in the family, he took care of my family, and we were just so blessed to know him. But Roy came over and he goes, you know, Kay, and I was hitting the horse about at the stirrup, and he goes, so how do you feel about these horses? And I go, I love horses. So he had a wrangler come over and he plopped me up on that horse, and that's one of my fondest memories. But anytime Roy was here in Marceline or we saw him in California, he was the one who took care of us. He always took care of us.
Kay, thank you so much for sharing your story with me about Walt Disney and Roy Disney and the family, your own personal experiences with them and the family and the museum, the town. You've been so gracious to me. Now, I'm about to head into town, so are there any places in town you could point out that you want me to visit before I leave?
I can do better than that. Why don't I go with you?
Really?
Yeah, let's go.
Kay Malins is going to take me on a tour of Marceline. How can you beat that? All right, let's go. Thank you very much. Let's go.